Hello, good afternoon. Well, I wanted to start off by thanking Kapwani, Gaitan, Anais, everyone who put so much work and effort to bring us all here. It's a lot of work, but it's really special. So I'm an anthropologist, so everything that I do leads to stories. That's what we end up doing in the end, and ethnography is a story. So I'll also start with one. So a few years ago, I visited a gifted artist named Samara, who lives in a Kuruaya village called Irinapani. It's located on the Kuruaya River in eastern Amazonia. She specializes in making beautiful necklaces, armbands, and other types of body adornments using glass beads. The pictures here being projected show some of her work, and it requires a level of patience, motor skill, and concentration that I admire profoundly. She says that what's most tiring about making it is because it requires so much of the eye. Like, you need to find the hole and be constantly trying to prick it. So if you skip the next one, there's another example of her work. And as most bead artists from the Kuruaya River, Samara Kuruaya uses glass beads made in the Preciosa factory in the Czech Republic. Samara told me that these beads are much easier to work with because of their regular size and shape. She said that she once tried to use cheaper ones that were made in China, but quickly realized that it was worth paying the price of the ones she preferred. She buys her seed beads from a store in Altamira, which is the closest town to her village. Close meaning 9 days by boat, by the regular boat, or 3 days on the fast outboard motorboats that are becoming more common in the region over the past decade or so. And although it can be difficult to find a ride in these boats, when I would go to her village, I usually took the regular one that took 9 days. They are still kind of frequent enough that Samara and her toddler son can go to town once or maybe twice a year to run errands, to see relatives, and to restock on glass beads. It wasn't always like this. Back when access to the Kuruaya River was more difficult, glass beads were difficult to come by. So I asked her how she managed to work back then. And in reply, she told me the following story. So once, my father came back from a hunt and brought me a handful of beads. They were dirty, but we cleaned them carefully, and it turned out that they were still usable. I asked him where he had found them, and he said, "Well, I chased a peccary into a part of the forest I don't usually go. I killed it, and as I was walking back to the village, I saw some colorful gleam next to a stream. I found these beads right there in the mud next to the water. I gathered some and brought them along, but I was already weighted down by the peccary, so I left a lot of them behind. There were so many beads there in the river." Samara said that since her father told her that story, she often thinks about asking him to take her to that place, but she hasn't gotten around to it yet. And it also takes a lot of time to clean up the beads, so she prefers to just buy them at the store in Altamira. She said that the beads were of the same kind, the ones that her dad found in the forest and those that she buys in the store. And to my surprise, she said, that's how people used to make jewelry back in the old days. They got their beads from the forest. So if you jump to the next picture, this is an example of Kuruaya beadwork from 100 years ago. This was collected by a German explorer named Emilis Nettlage, who visited the Kuruaya village in 1915. The beads are, well, they look, at least to my uneducated eye, like very much the same. So ever since Samara told me this story, I've been puzzled by its implications. She said that she prefers glass beads that come from this specific factory in Bohemia, and she also told me that the glass beads are exactly the same kind that can also be found on the forest floor. So how can both of these statements be true, right? So to understand these assertions side by side, I think we must keep in mind two things at once. First, we can look for clues by approaching her story through a historical lenses, focusing on the historical records of colonial interactions between capitalism and Kuruaya history. And we can do this by looking and accessing the archives of Amazonia, particularly the travelogues of European explorers that document some key events taking place around the time that glass beads started to appear in the Kurua River in the late 19th century. However, I don't think that this is enough. To get to the bottom of the story, it's also critical to keep in mind how some of the ideas about the world commonly found among the Kuruaya and their neighbors are reflected in the story itself. We can investigate this primarily by looking at how mythology explains the appearance of Western commodities in their villages. In this talk, I will explore a bit of both the European and the Amazonian conception of the movements and routes that glass beads take, where they come from, and what people do with them, and finish with a quick reflection on the relationship between nature and art in Amazonia and beyond. So, in the late 19th century, a French explorer named Henri Coudreau navigated up the Xingu River looking for, in his words, true Indians. He never found them. Like many explorers of the time, Coudreau was trapped in his own fantasy of discovering people untouched by Western influences and wasn't able to realize the folly of classifying people as pure or impure. And by the end of that expedition to the Xingu River, his frustration impelled him to an odd gesture. He decided to take the 45 kilograms of seed beads that he brought along with him and make an ex voto, a votive offering to the indigenous people he never found. He writes in his diary that he left the beads on a site known as Pedra Seca. Not long after, a group of Yuja people traveled up the same Xingu River, fleeing from the social turmoil caused by the rubber boom in the lower stretches of the Xingu. As they stopped by Pedra Seca, they noticed a gleam on the floor and found the treasure that the odd Frenchman had left behind. Just as in Samara's father's story, they dug them out of the mud, cleaned them, and took it with them to their new homes in the upper Xingu River, where the Yuja still live today. In the 1980s, Tânia Stolze Lima, an anthropologist who lived and works with them, was gifted a necklace made from these old beads that I got to see. So if we think about these clues, these historical clues, it suggests an explanation for how Samara's father found seed beads in the forest floor, right? So although the Kuruaya live about 5 days by boat from Pedra Seca, where the beads were found, the Kuruaya have close ties with the Yuja since at least the 19th century, and stories such as these certainly circulated between them. And, whether the father actually found beads in the forest or repurposed an old story to entertain his child, it's difficult to say. Every year when my nieces and nephews ask me where their gifts come from, I tell them that they came from the North Pole, which is a much less plausible idea, but that still has considerable purchase with them. And on reflection, I think I tell that story to preserve a sense of wonder and belief in generosity and the value of good behavior. Just as I suspect that Samara's father could have been telling his story to convey ideas and values that are important to him. But there's also the possibility that what Coudreau did was perhaps not so odd, that other explorers and traders might have left behind, intentionally or unintentionally, large quantities of conteries that are still waiting to be found in remote corners of Amazonia. It's perfectly possible that Samara's father just so happened to come by one of such deposits. We could stop at this point in the talk and content ourselves with having found both a sociological and a historical explanation for the question of where Samara's story comes from. But I like to push the story just a little further and think it in relation to some Amazonian myths and concepts that I learned from my friends in the Xingu, as well as from other anthropologists. So in the 1920s, Kurt Nimwendaju, the founding father of Brazilian anthropology, collected some myths among a group of Yuja people known as Shipaya. One myth explains the origin of Western commodities such as steel knives and axes that had become of common usage among them in the previous decades. According to the myth, a man elopes with his sister-in-law to the headwaters of the Iriri River, an affluent of the Xingu, and there they discovered that when they lowered a piece of lumber into the water, knife fish and axe fish attacked the piece of lumber and became stuck to the wood. So the lovers collected these fish and they became their tools. The myth goes on that in another stretch of the river, they found that birds ate tiny fish that got stranded in pools in the rocks. The little fish bones that remained were glass beads of all colors that they gathered to begin their new lives. This myth that was written down a century ago, about the same time as the myth that we read in the previous section, it seems to have a very similar conceptual goal as Samara's story, to locate the origin of glass beads in relation to what we think of as nature. It sounds strange to our ears because knowing that the beads come from factories, it's very hard to imagine that they could come from the forest or from the bones of tiny fish. No two things could be more distant in our minds, right? And yet, in these accounts and myths, it's as if that conceptual distance between factory and forest didn't matter at all. So this takes us back to the question from where we started. How can they both be true? Well, I think that there are a couple of elements that we need to think about to understand this. The first is to think of what a factory is for someone who has never seen one, who didn't grow up close to them. Now, factories are very peculiar places that were first created in places such as here in Venice, like the Arsenal, where European civilization was busy creating a colonial exchange system whose logic does not make sense to most of my friends in Amazonia. The concept of industrial production, in its essence, the transformation of natural resources into artificial commodities, is something that only makes sense within a social context that naturalizes the expropriation of resources and the alienation of labor. As the French anthropologist Philippe Desquelles would say, nothing gets produced in such way in Amazonia. Fishing, hunting, growing crops, and even the inspiration for making songs and pieces of art are conceptualized as exchanges with spirit masters who control game, who make cassava grow, and teach us songs in our dreams. That's where songs come from as well. They are also the product of exchange. And most Amazonians take for granted that labor is not meant to be alienated. Another anthropologist, Thais Mantovanelli, a friend who works with the Mebingo-Cré people of the Bacajá River, often says that her friends in the village assume that she knows how to build cars, computers, and airplanes in her home in the city, even though she tells them that the most she has ever accomplished was changing her flat tire. It is hard for them to accept that we live lives in which the objects we use every day are so alien to ourselves. So, keeping this in mind, perhaps we can understand the mythological explanation of the origin of seed beads as reflecting a very different conception of how things come to be and circulate in the world. It makes a lot of sense to say that seed beads come from both Bohemia and the forest when you inhabit a world in which objects are always obtained through exchange, be it with white people or with non-human entities. A world in which the difference between what is natural and what is human-made is rather blurry and largely irrelevant. This Amazonian perspective that I learned from Samara and other people that I met there might seem exotic at first, but I think that her way of thinking and the art that she makes is not so distant from what many other artists do. I wouldn't be the first to say that much art aims to disrupt and reassemble too easy binarisms that organize the world into natural and artificial, intentional and accidental, permanent and impermanent, male and female. Some of that force can be found in the artworks that we find here in Venice right now. So the first time that I saw pictures of the Canadian Pavilion here at the Biennale, I thought that the blue glass beads covering the building looked like something that had descended from the sky, its shine evoking morning dew or window panes after the rain. And in a remarkably similar vein, when I asked Samara what she liked most about her art, she said that she loved to cover herself and her friends with her jewelry during the festivals they held in her village. She said that when they put on their jewelry, they transformed into something else, and that the beauty that they were emulating was that of snakes and jaguars, who are also covered in colorful patterns. If you show the picture of a snake, it really resembles some of her art. So I think that what she was telling me was that glass beads allow her to make a world in which she and her friends and family can transform themselves, can blur even the lines between the human and the non-human. They can bring the village together in their festivals and incorporate the beauty that lies beyond the human, and even objectify this connection that they have with the white people that they buy their seed beads from. The roots that brought seed beads to her village don't really finish there. The seed beads are only the beginning of all these possibilities of becoming someone else. So, thank you.